So this is our first look at the sort of structure of the body of a speech. So the first thing I told you in our previous little mini lecture that I start teaching with the body because I think that's where you should start writing your speech. There is one exception, and that's that we do need to have a thesis. And the thesis is a structural part that takes place in the introduction. So we do need to have a thesis prior to writing the body. Obviously, we can't decide what our three main points will be until we know what our topic will be. Plus, we need to know whether it's an inform or a persuade because that will adjust our organization. But once we know that, we can start to arrange our body. So the first thing that I want to talk about is what we do once we're into the body of the speech. In this class, I demand that there are three main points and only three main points. There are speeches out there in the world that are two main points, or maybe five or six main points. If a speech is, 2 hours long, it's hard to really say, well, here's the three things we're going to cover today and spread that out over 2 hours. There's probably much more than that. But in this class, I demand three. Why three? If we do two in a 6 to 8 minute speech, typically what happens is we give too much information on two things, and people get a little tired of hearing just those few things. It dives too deep. If we go with four, chances are we've sped through the main points so fast that it's very superficial and it's hard to give people anything that's worthwhile. Three is the sort of magic number for a lot of speeches, but particularly in a class where the speech is going to be 6 to 8 minutes. So I demand that they be only three main points. I also want you to do everything you possibly can to shorten those labels. So you wouldn't want to say, for example, a long label, we're going to talk about the players, coaches, and stadiums of the Pittsburgh Steelers in the 1970s, then talk about the players, coaches, and stadiums of the Steelers in the 1980s, and then the players, coaches. Do you see how that's very wordy? So instead, what you would want to say is, we'll talk about Steelers in the 70s, Steelers in the 80s, Steelers in the 90s. Maybe we would even say Steelers in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s. We need our labels on our main points to be as short as they can possibly be. If we shorten those labels, it makes it more comprehensible to our audience as they hear. We don't want to overwhelm people with too many words. This is an art, oral communication, that takes place in time, which is different than written communication. Written communication takes place on a page, and we can go back and revisit things if we're ever confused. So those simple labels make it easier for people to recollect. It shortens our previews, which makes things more understandable, which shortens our transitions between main points. And I'm moving like this because later on I'm going to teach you about using the zone of interaction. So it shortens transitions, and it also shortens our summaries. So there's lots of benefits to having simple labels. And on the body of a speech, we want to use Roman numerals when we're putting those on an outline. We want Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3 on our outlines at the main point level. And when you are organizing your main points 1, 2, and 3, you want to think about the organization of that. Do you want it chronological? Do you want it topical? Do you want it categorical? Do you want it spatial? And we'll talk more about those in detail later. So think about that. And then we also want the balance of each main point to be fairly strong. So it's not just a time consideration, but if this was a 6 to 8 minute speech, if we did a minute and a half underneath each one, that'd be a minute and a half plus another minute and a half makes 3 minutes, plus another minute and a half makes 4 minutes and 30 seconds. That leaves us about a minute and a half or a little bit more for the intro and the conclusion. So that would have pretty good balance if each one was about a minute and a half. If we find that main point 1, it's easy to write 3.5 minutes worth of content, but we'd only getting 30 seconds of content in 2 or 3, I'm being extreme with that. What we might want to do is take main point 1, the A, B, and C, which is the subpoints underneath that, and say we're only going to talk about the A, B, and C, and we turn our A, B's, and C's into a main point 1, 2, and 3. So if, for example, I wanted to talk about the Steelers in the 70s, the players, coaches, and stadiums, and then I wanted to do in the 80s and 90s, but the 80s isn't that interesting for the Steelers. What I might do is say, well, let me not talk about 80s and 90s, and instead let me make main point 1 about the players, main point 2 about the coaches, and main point 3 about the stadiums, right? So that's a way for us to make sure that we stay in that 6 to 8 minute time frame, and we have good balance underneath each one. So it's not important that each main point be exactly the same amount of time, but that they be near the same amount of time. And a better way to think of your main points is, do I have something worthwhile in main point 1? worthwhile in 2 and worthwhile in 3, well, that's good insight balance. If you find you have 3 great things in main point 1, something kind of casually interesting underneath main point 2, that's a problem. It means you really have your most interesting stuff here and not there. Okay, so the ordering and the balance is something that you want to think about. And that's my little mini lecture off of slide number 3.